The night had barely settled when the sound of sirens cut through the calm like a knife piercing silence. Families who had just finished their evening meals jumped up in panic. Parents rushed to find their children and grabbed whatever they could carry. Within seconds, entire neighborhoods transformed into scenes of chaos. Headlights from cars filled the streets. Some people abandoned vehicles in the middle of the road and sprinted toward underground shelters. The sky lit up with sudden streaks of light. Explosions echoed across Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and smaller towns. The air grew thick with fear and confusion. No one knew how many rockets or drones were coming, but the waves seemed endless. Every boom shook the ground. Every siren screamed louder than the last. The people of Israel felt more vulnerable than they had in decades. If you are watching this right now, make sure to subscribe to USA Defense Daily. These events are not just stories. They are lessons about how modern warfare is evolving in ways no one could predict. Staying informed is the only way to truly understand what is shaping our world. Videos appeared online within minutes. Dramatic footage showed interceptor missiles arcing through the night sky, each one chasing down a rocket or drone. The flashes of collisions looked like fireworks to outsiders, but to those on the ground they were terrifying reminders that not everything could be stopped. Smoke and fire spread across the horizon. Some drones slipped past defenses. Warehouses ignited. Fuel depots burst into flames. One strike near an industrial zone sent plumes of black smoke billowing into the air, visible for miles. Firefighters struggled against massive blazes. Ambulances wailed through the streets, rushing the injured to overcrowded hospitals. The chaos of the night only deepened. Inside Israel's command centers, the atmosphere was tense. Large digital maps glowed red with markers, each representing incoming threats. Officers scrambled, giving orders. Soldiers monitored screens tracking flight paths of rockets and drones. The Iron Dome system, designed to make rapid calculations, worked at full capacity. But drones did not follow predictable arcs like rockets. They flew low, fast, and often in irregular patterns, confusing even the most advanced algorithms. Operators faced impossible choices. Fire interceptors at every target and risk running out of ammunition, or try to pick carefully and risk missing one that could devastate a city. Either decision carried consequences. Ordinary families huddled in shelters beneath concrete walls. The air was heavy with fear. Children clung to their mothers, covering their ears from the deafening sounds of explosions. Fathers tried to stay calm, whispering reassurances they barely believed themselves. The sense of security, built carefully over decades with billions of dollars invested in missile defense, was cracking with each impact. The psychological damage was as severe as the physical destruction. People no longer trusted their shield completely. They realized that, for the first time in years, danger was slipping through. Across the world, television networks interrupted programming with live coverage. Dramatic images of explosions over Tel Aviv looped again and again. Anchors spoke with urgency. Analysts debated the effectiveness of Israel's defense system. Commentators in neighboring regions celebrated the symbolic victory of low-cost drones defeating billion-dollar systems. In Gaza, militants released videos of their launches, holding them up as proof that they had pierced what once seemed impenetrable. To many in the region, it was not just a tactical event, but a political message. Israel could bleed. For the Israeli government, pressure mounted instantly. Netanyahu appeared on screens addressing the nation. His voice was firm, his promises of retaliation uncompromising, but his tired expression betrayed the weight on his shoulders. Critics seized the moment. Opposition leaders accused him of weakness, of failing to foresee the growing drone threat. Crowds gathered in protest, demanding stronger leadership and demanding answers to why defenses had faltered. Signs filled the streets. Voices chanted against the government. The bond between the people and their leaders grew weaker with each passing hour. International reactions poured in. Washington reaffirmed its support, promising aid and resources, but behind closed doors, American officials expressed concern about how fragile the situation appeared. European leaders called emergency meetings. Some pushed for an immediate ceasefire. Others emphasized Israel's right to defend itself. The United Nations convened yet another late-night discussion, but as so many times before, no firm solutions emerged. Only statements of concern and urgent calls for restraint. The most striking part of this crisis was the imbalance of cost. Experts pointed out that each drone may have cost only a few $100s, yet Israel was forced to respond with interceptors worth tens of thousands each. It was like watching a nation bled slowly by the economics of war. The logic was terrifying. It suggested that no matter how wealthy or technologically advanced a military might be, it could be ground down by opponents willing to use cheap weapons in overwhelming numbers. As the night stretched on, social media exploded with images of destruction. Videos of families running to shelters, photos of flames lighting up the skyline. Hashtags trended worldwide, fueling debates from Washington to Istanbul to Tehran. In neighboring countries, commentators emphasized that Israel was not invincible. Its aura of deterrence had been shattered, even if only slightly. The symbolism mattered as much as the physical strikes. For decades, Israel projected itself as untouchable. Now that image was being questioned. For its adversaries, that was a victory in itself. Back inside Israel, hospitals struggled with a steady flow of injured. The wounded told reporters of narrow escapes. Buildings collapsed around them. Glass shattered into living rooms. Fires spread through neighborhoods. The human toll grew with every hour. Firefighters worked without pause. Soldiers were deployed to assist civilians. Emergency hotlines were overwhelmed with calls. The psychological toll became clearer. Parents admitted they no longer felt they could promise their children safety. Children who once trusted the sound of the Iron Dome intercepting threats now cried in fear, convinced it would not be enough. The shield was cracked, and so was the trust. As dawn approached, fires still smoldered. Smoke rose across the horizon. Exhausted families emerged from shelters, their eyes red from sleepless nights. The first morning light revealed scars. Burned cars, destroyed warehouses, shattered windows, and streets covered in debris. Cameras captured these scenes, broadcasting them to the world. Many rockets and drones had been intercepted, but enough had broken through to leave visible marks on the city. The sense of absolute security had vanished. Questions about the future grew louder. In those early hours, Israelis asked whether their leaders had underestimated the growing drone threat, whether billions invested in defense were enough when facing enemies willing to adapt with cheap and numerous weapons. The symbolism of the night was undeniable. Israel had faced barrages before, but never like this, never in such coordinated numbers, never in a way that made its strongest defenses look fragile. The balance of power had not shifted completely, but the perception had, and perception in war is as powerful as reality. This was not just a night of explosions. It was a moment of awakening, a reminder that even the strongest nations carry vulnerabilities. Technology alone cannot guarantee safety. The impact would not end with the rising sun. It would echo in politics, in strategy, and in the psychology of a people who had long believed they were protected by walls of steel and systems of precision. The shield still stood, but cracks had been revealed. And those cracks would shape the conflicts to come. The escalation did not end with rockets and drones raining down overnight. It carried forward into the morning and into the hearts of millions. The strikes shook not only Israel, but the entire region. Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Iran, and even faraway capitals were pulled into the storm. As the sun rose over Tel Aviv, the city was covered with smoke trails lingering in the sky. Buildings bore scars of impact. Families struggled to recover from another sleepless night. Television screens showed endless loops of interceptions and explosions. Conversations shifted from the battles themselves to the consequences spiraling outward. Egypt found itself at the center of attention as always. It had long been the bridge between Israel and Gaza, the mediator called upon whenever the fighting crossed a dangerous line. In Cairo, newspapers ran bold headlines condemning the bloodshed. Opposition voices grew louder, demanding stronger stances. Thousands of citizens poured into the streets, waving Palestinian flags and chanting slogans. The government tried to balance carefully, issuing statements about restraint and dialogue. But behind closed doors, pressure was immense. Cairo could not ignore the anger of its people, nor could it afford to break delicate peace agreements with Israel. The balancing act Egypt had played for decades now seemed more fragile than ever. Washington released statements reaffirming unwavering support for Israel, but American officials were aware of the dangerous optics. The White House urged Israel to limit civilian harm, hinting at concern that this conflict could undo years of quiet diplomacy. The U.S. Congress was divided. Some lawmakers pushed for more weapons and funding. Others questioned whether the cycle of escalation was sustainable. Divisions grew louder on social media, where images of suffering civilians circulated faster than official statements. Americans thousands of miles away debated a conflict that seemed distant, yet emotionally close because of its human cost. Europe, too, was rattled. Leaders in Brussels, Berlin, and Paris called emergency meetings. Some pushed for ceasefire, warning of humanitarian disaster. Others repeated that Israel had the right to defend itself. Yet no real solution was offered. Unity slipped into rhetoric. The crisis continued without meaningful international intervention. The United Nations held late-night sessions, speeches filled with concern, but resolutions stalled. While governments argued, the human situation worsened in Gaza. Families packed into damaged homes or crowded shelters without electricity, water, or food. Aid organizations warned of shortages. Hospitals operated on backup generators, trying to save lives as airstrikes continued. Cries of children filled hallways. Parents searched desperately for medicine. Images from the ground told a story no politician could dismiss. The crisis was not only military. It was humanitarian, growing worse by the hour. Inside Israel, politics erupted. Netanyahu faced enormous criticism. His promises of security seemed hollow as rockets slipped through defenses. Protesters filled the streets, demanding his resignation. The opposition accused him of ignoring the drone threat, of failing to prepare. Cabinet ministers argued over strategy. Some demanded harsher retaliation. Others warned that wider escalation could drag neighboring countries directly into the conflict. Every decision carried enormous risk. The government seemed split between appearing strong and avoiding a war that might spiral out of control. Economists warned about imbalance of cost. Drones that cost a few $100s forced Israel to launch interceptors worth tens of thousands. A single night of interceptions cost millions. The economic pressure was unsustainable and strategically dangerous. Analysts argued that Israel could be bled financially over time, even without overwhelming destruction. The future of warfare felt visible. Swarms of low-cost drones overwhelming expensive defenses. Laser-based systems like the much-discussed Iron Beam were touted as the answer, but still years away from deployment. Tonight the future had arrived too soon. Israel's systems were strong but not invincible. Every interception bought seconds of relief. Every missed drone reminded people that the sky could never be fully trusted again. The battlefield had shifted, and with it the psychology of war. Regional powers like Iran and Turkey seized the opportunity. Iranian media replayed footage of strikes, framing them as proof that Israel could be challenged. Turkey's president gave fiery speeches, demanding international action and positioning himself as a defender of Palestinian rights. Saudi Arabia and Gulf states, which had cautiously pursued normalization with Israel, faced new pressures. Their publics demanded solidarity with Gaza. Their governments hesitated, knowing ties with Israel could be shaken. Every statement, every silence was scrutinized by millions. The conflict was no longer just between Israel and Gaza. It was reshaping the entire diplomatic map of the Middle East. The symbolism was powerful. Israel's image of invulnerability, built over decades, was damaged even if only slightly. In international politics, perception mattered as much as reality. Israel had not been defeated militarily, but its reputation was dented. For adversaries, that was proof that persistence and adaptation could challenge a stronger power. For Israel, this meant a long road of rebuilding, not just structures but confidence. Confidence of its citizens and confidence of its allies. Ordinary people bore the weight of uncertainty. In Israel, families emerged from shelters into streets filled with shattered glass and burned cars. In Gaza, families searched for missing relatives under rubble. Each side carried stories of fear, grief, and exhaustion. The human suffering was undeniable, crossing all borders. Children cried in shelters. Parents whispered reassurances they barely believed. Neighborhoods sat in darkness, unsure when the next strike would come. These scenes spread around the world, fueling debates, protests, and demands for change. As the conflict stretched into days, then weeks, talks of ceasefire surfaced. Egyptian officials attempted to mediate. The United Nations pushed for humanitarian corridors. Aid convoys lined up at borders waiting for access. Yet no effort offered a permanent solution. Everyone knew the cycle: strikes, retaliation, mediation, temporary ceasefire, then another round later. The grim familiarity added to despair. Analysts warned this round was different. Heavy drone use, saturation of defenses, cracks shown in Israel's shield. These were not temporary issues, but signs of a shifting era. Military strategists compared it to the introduction of tanks in World War I or nuclear weapons in World War II, technologies that permanently redefined battlefields. Israel had faced the first true swarm attacks. While it held the line, it showed vulnerabilities that would echo far into the future. In the end, this was not only about rockets or drones. It was about the future of conflict, about leadership under pressure, about the resilience of ordinary people caught in endless cycles of escalation. Israel survived the night, but questions about tomorrow grew louder than explosions. What new technologies would emerge? Who would rise to mediate? How long could civilians endure lives lived under constant alarms and fire from the sky? These were questions with no simple answers. As the dust settled, one truth stood above all others. Wars are no longer fought only with strength. They are fought with perception, with economics, with technology that levels the field between rich and poor, powerful and powerless. This escalation was proof that every shield has cracks, and every nation, no matter how strong, is vulnerable when the rules of battle begin to change. So as you finish watching this, make sure to subscribe to USA Defense Daily for more deep analysis on how these conflicts are reshaping our world. Stay informed, stay aware, because in times like these, every moment matters. The future of global security is being written in the skies above the Middle East.